Hello everyone. I wanted to talk today about philosophy and its connection to language. Since the late part of the 19th century, there's been a tradition in philosophy known as the analytic tradition, which is the goal of which has been to have conceptual clarity, to get clear about our terminology. And so if you look at this section of logic that we're involved in now, it's about trying to be precise about language and not commit fallacies with language and so on. So Bertrand Russell, a British philosopher who lived from 1872 to 1970, used a particular example that is kind of interesting in this respect. He said, the Golden Mountain does not exist. Some people say, well, what's that about? It seems to be a bit of a paradox. We've named something the Golden Mountain, and some people think that if you name something, there's an entity that also exists that those words refer to. And he says we can't compare it to the square circle does not exist, even though square circles do not exist. But so this is part of the bewitchment with language. If you use examples like that, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who incidentally an Austrian philosopher who between him and Russell, probably the two greatest philosophers of the 20th century, said that philosophers have always raised the dust and then they complain that they cannot see. So they ask these big questions like, is there a God? Is there immortality? What is justice? And so forth. But you must spend time, Wittgenstein thought, in getting clear about the language. Otherwise, if you didn't, then you would have problems sorting these problems out. I don't know that it's that simple myself. I think we can be clear about the language. That doesn't mean the problems are, just because we are clear, easy to solve. But I want to show, aside from the fallacies we'll get to in a moment, how language concerns in philosophy apply to ethics and metaphysics. Well, let's take the metaphysics case first. When you start naming things like the Golden Mountain, and you say it doesn't exist, there's no contradiction in saying that, because we've just used an adjective golden and a noun. Doesn't mean that there is such a thing. So in metaphysics, people like to talk about things like souls and gods and spirits and ghosts. And because we use the nouns, people might assume that these things actually exist. But it isn't necessarily true. In fact, Western philosophy in general, the entire Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, dating back nearly 3,000 years, wants to define God as a being who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, having those three attributes, and therefore a perfect being. But you could say, I've thought about this, just because I've used that language to describe God in these infinite attributes, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, does that mean such a being exists? Well, clearly not. All we're using is language, and the language doesn't instantiate any real object necessarily. God might exist. I'm not saying that atheism is true here. You can't be sure that God doesn't exist. But so there is this way that language being clear about language applies to concerns in metaphysics. Metaphysics is that branch of philosophy. Meta means beyond, and beyond the physical world. Is there something beyond the physical world? People will ask, if you ask people why they believe in God, one reason people will throw out is that they believe in miracles. But even take that word, we have to be clear about what that means. If a miracle means a suspension of a natural law, something happens, where gravity, let's say, ceases to work, or something of that sort, then, well, that might be miraculous because natural laws were kind of put on hold for the moment. But some people will say it's a miracle that someone recovered from a serious illness. Former President Jimmy Carter had brain cancer just a few years ago, and it now seems to be in the clear from that. Is that a miracle, or is there some scientific explanation for his recovering from the cancer? Probably some explanation based in science for why that is the case. So now I said that this can also be used in ethics before we talk about the fallacies. People think that questions of ethics are easily answered. It's applied philosophy. Well, suppose I ask you, is capital punishment just? Or moral. Same thing as capital punishment. Morally justified. Well, that's a first order question, we can say. And in order to answer that first order question, we may need to get clear about a second order question. Namely, what do you mean by justice? There could be at least two schools of thought here. Some people might think it's just in the sense that it's retribution. The capital criminal is getting his just deserts for having committed this capital crime. And so there's a retribution that is in order. And so in that sense of justice, someone might say, well, yeah, it's just. Another person who's not a retributivist about justice might be a deterrence theorist and might point out that, well, even in those states where capital punishment is legal, where we put people to death for capital crimes, the crime rates, the murder rates aren't any less. They seem to have no statistical effect on a reduction in capital crimes. So there's at least those two different senses of justice that you have to take up. So to sum up there, in order to answer the hot button question, is abortion just, is capital punishment moral, is euthanasia morally justified, we have to get clear about our terminology, and that we might have to answer those first order questions, those big questions in ethics, if you will. We have to get clear about the second order questions. So in other words, we have to sharpen the knives before we can cut any meat. And so that's an interesting part of language philosophy. Now we've come up against a few fallacies in language's connection with logic. There are fallacies of equivocation. These are fallacies of ambiguity. That's the larger category, right? And under that category, under that heading of fallacies of ambiguity, we have one is equivocation. Equivocation is when I use a single word in more than one way in the course of an argument. So the Constitution guarantees me freedom. Suppose I use that as a premise. Therefore, I should have the freedom to assault you. Well, notice how the word freedom there has changed in its meaning. Freedom in the first case is the freedom of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, we could say. In the second case, freedom is license, is equated with license, or the absence of restraint, to do anything you will. No one thinks that's so. There you've equivocated on the word freedom. And some of you pointed out in examples that it's a fallacy of ambiguity if to someone to say, I did not have sex with that woman, and well, what do we mean by sex in this case? As a former president said in testifying, that we have to be clear about what that meant. So fallacies of equivocation again use the same word in at least two different ways, and that leads to a fallacy. There's also fallacies of amphibole, closely related to the fallacies of equivocation, except here the faulty device is the sentence structure. If I say, throw Papa down the stairs his hat, probably the best thing would be to say is throw the hat down the stairs to Papa, but in a Germanic construction it might come out to throw Papa down the stairs his hat. And there it's the sentence structure, the syntax of the sentence that's leading to a double meaning. So there you have a fallacy of amphibole. An advertisement might say coats half off. And you might say before, why would I buy half a coat? Well, the coats half off, if unspecified, probably meant 50% reduction in price. So that's the intended meaning. The unintended meaning is usually the funny one. You'll get yourself half a coat. So these are examples of fallacies that come up when we're not clear about the language. We'll also get the fallacy of composition and the fallacy of division, which are, as opposed to the fallacies of relevance that we looked at, those are all under the heading of fallacies of ambiguity, where language is unclear. So language is quite important. It has been in the history of philosophy. Plato was doing analytic philosophy, you could say, 2,400 years ago, because the Republic, which some people consider to be the greatest work of philosophy ever written, some 10 books combined, almost 500 pages, the question is, what is justice? And he's trying to sort out the meaning of what justice is. Socrates, in the dialogue, the Euthyphro, is asking, what is piety? And so this is, let's be clear about the meaning of a word. And Socrates' conviction was, unless you could be clear about the meaning of the word and knew what it meant, then you had no right to really apply it in actual life. He's being charged with impiety in Athens, and he must appear in the court to defend himself for impiety, but do they really know what impiety means? So language, very important to make any progress in philosophy at all, and so that's all I have to say to you today about that. I'll see you again soon talking about more of the fallacies. Have a good day.